The autumn of 1867 brought Elizabeth Thornton to the high plains of eastern Wyoming Territory with nothing but a land patent, a wagon full of tools, and a reputation that preceded her by 300 miles. She was 42 years old, widowed 2 years prior when her husband died of pneumonia in Nebraska, and she'd decided that depending on men for survival was a luxury she could no longer afford. By late September, she'd staked her claim on a quarter section near the Laramie River, built a soddy that measured 18 by 20 feet, and started construction on something that made every homesteader within 10 miles question her sanity. While other settlers built their woodsheds 20 or 30 paces from their homes, Elizabeth was framing a continuous structure that encircled her entire soddy like a wooden fortress. "Woman's lost her mind with grief," said Patricia Drummond, whose family had been in the territory since 1864. She'd ridden over specifically to see what Elizabeth was building, and couldn't make sense of the design. The shed wrapped all 4 sides of the soddy, creating a covered corridor roughly 7 feet wide that completely surrounded Elizabeth's living space. "You're wasting timber," Patricia continued, not unkindly. "A proper shed takes half the wood and does the same job." Elizabeth didn't stop working, just kept setting posts and notching crossbeams with a precision that suggested she'd done this before. "Does it keep your firewood dry when the wind's blowing 40 miles an hour from 3 directions at once?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Patricia had no answer for that. What nobody knew yet was that Elizabeth Thornton had spent 18 years married to a surveyor who'd worked for the railroad across 4 territories. She'd lived through winters in places where conventional wisdom got people killed, where the difference between survival and freezing was often just better planning rather than harder work. Her husband had been meticulous about documentation, keeping journals full of observations about how different homesteads fared through harsh seasons. Elizabeth had read every word after he died, studying patterns of success and failure like they were scripture. One entry from the winter of 1862 described a Norwegian family near Fort Laramie, whose fuel storage wrapped their cabin completely. They'd outlasted a blizzard that killed livestock and collapsed buildings across the region, never once running short of dry wood. Elizabeth had copied that entry into her own journal 3 times, memorizing every detail. The criticism intensified as the structure took shape. Jacob Reeves, a former Army quartermaster who prided himself on efficient resource management, calculated that Elizabeth was using nearly 400 board feet of lumber that could have built a conventional shed twice over. "That's money you won't get back," he told her bluntly. "Timber's expensive out here. You're building like you've got a sawmill in your backyard." Sarah Chen, whose husband had worked on railroad construction before they settled, worried about the structural integrity. "All that weight pressing against your soddy walls," she said, examining the connection points. "One hard wind, and the whole thing could collapse inward, crush your home." Even Reverend Thomas Walsh, who generally encouraged self-reliance, suggested that Elizabeth's design showed a lack of faith in community support. "We help each other through winter," he reminded her. "You don't need to build like you're the only soul for 100 miles. But Elizabeth had learned something her critics hadn't considered. Isolation wasn't about distance, it was about accessibility. During a Wyoming blizzard, your neighbor might as well be in St. Louis if you can't reach them through 8-foot drifts and 60-mile-per-hour winds. She'd watched her husband struggle through a February storm in 1865, trying to reach their woodpile 30 feet from their Nebraska cabin. He'd gotten disoriented in whiteout conditions, wandered in circles for 20 minutes, and came back inside with frostbitten fingers that hurt for weeks afterward. 6 months later, he couldn't shake a chest cold that turned into the pneumonia that killed him. Elizabeth had made a decision then. She would never again design her survival around the assumption that she could safely travel even short distances in extreme weather. If you're watching because you value stories about people who thought differently and survived because of it, Stories about women who built their own solutions when conventional wisdom wasn't enough. Consider subscribing. We're preserving knowledge about how ordinary people solved extraordinary problems, one documented story at a time. Elizabeth completed the basic framework by mid-October, working alone, except for occasional help from Samuel Whitfield, a freedman who'd homesteaded 2 miles south. Samuel understood immediately what Elizabeth was building because he'd seen similar designs in Tennessee, where his grandmother had taught him that smart building meant thinking 3 seasons ahead. "You're making a buffer zone," Samuel said, helping Elizabeth raise the north wall's top beam. "The shed protects the wood insulates the house stays warmer, you burn less fuel. It's a circle that feeds itself." Elizabeth nodded, grateful that at least one person understood the logic without needing extensive explanation. The structure's dimensions were precise, calculated from her husband's journal entries and her own observations. The shed's outer walls stood 8 feet tall, built from rough-hewn pine posts, and horizontal planks chinked with clay mixed with prairie grass. The roof sloped gently outward from the soddy's walls, covered with overlapping cedar shakes that would shed snow rather than accumulate weight. Inside the corridor, Elizabeth installed a series of wooden platforms at varying heights, creating storage zones optimized for different purposes. The lowest level, about 8 inches off the ground, was for firewood that needed air circulation. The middle level held tools and supplies. The highest platforms, where warmth from the soddy's walls rose and collected, were for items that benefited from being kept just above freezing: seed stores, dried vegetables, smoked meat. What made the design revolutionary wasn't just the circular layout, but Elizabeth's understanding of thermal dynamics. The soddy's walls, 3 feet thick at the base, built from prairie sod blocks cut with her own plow, absorbed heat from her interior stove during the day and radiated it slowly outward through the night. That radiant warmth, combined with the insulating effect of stacked firewood against the soddy's exterior, created a microclimate inside the shed that stayed significantly warmer than outside temperatures. During a cold snap, while the open prairie might drop to 20 below zero, the shed's interior rarely fell below 10 degrees. That 30-degree difference was the gap between frozen logs that wouldn't split and seasoned wood that burned clean and hot. Patricia Drummond noticed the effect first during an early November cold spell. She'd stopped by to borrow a cross-cut saw and found Elizabeth working inside the shed in just a wool sweater, no heavy coat required. Outside, the temperature was hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a brisk wind that made it feel closer to zero. "Aren't you freezing?" Patricia asked, her own hands numb inside thick gloves. Elizabeth shook her head, gestured to the walls around them. "The soddy's warm. The heat comes through the walls, and the firewood blocks the wind completely. It's actually comfortable in here." Patricia stood silent for a moment, feeling the temperature difference for herself. It was subtle, but real, maybe 20 degrees warmer than standing in the open. "I'll be damned," Patricia said quietly. The real test came in December, when the first major storm system moved through eastern Wyoming, with the kind of violence that reminded people why the territory still scared seasoned frontiersmen. The blizzard hit on December 11th, dropping temperatures to 31 below zero and piling snow into drifts that reached 12 feet in some locations. Wind gusts exceeded 50 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that lasted for 68 consecutive hours. Jacob Reeves lost access to his woodshed completely when the drift on his north side grew tall enough to cover the entire structure. He spent 9 hours digging before giving up, instead burning furniture and spare lumber to keep his family warm. Sarah Chen's family fared better because their shed sat on higher ground, but the door froze solid with accumulated ice. Her husband spent 40 minutes with hot water and a crowbar before he could access their fuel supply. By the time he got the stove burning properly again, their two young children were shivering so hard they couldn't speak clearly. The Drummond family's conventional shed, well built and carefully positioned, still left them exposed to the elements every time they needed fuel. Patricia made 17 trips through the blizzard over 3 days, each journey leaving her exhausted and dangerously cold. Her husband offered to take over the task, but Patricia refused, knowing he'd already injured his shoulder in a logging accident and couldn't afford to strain it worse. Elizabeth Thornton walked from her living space into her shed, through the interior door she'd cut in the soddy's east wall, selected seasoned pine from stacks that had been drying for 6 weeks in the shed's ambient warmth, and returned to her stove in under 45 seconds. She never put on a coat, never exposed herself to wind or blowing snow, never struggled with frozen wood or ice-covered supplies. The firewood was so dry from the shed's consistent warmth that it lit with a single match and burned with minimal smoke. She maintained her interior temperature at a comfortable 68 degrees throughout the entire storm, burning roughly 20% less wood than she'd calculated for conventional storage. When the storm finally broke on December 14th, Elizabeth stepped out into brilliant sunshine and found her neighbors digging out from devastation. The Reeves family had lost 3 chickens to the cold when their coop's heat lamp went out. The Chen children had developed coughs that sounded like gravel rattling in barrels. Patricia Drummond had pulled muscles in both legs from trudging through deep snow and would walk with a limp for 2 weeks. But what really drove the lesson home was what happened to the Mitchells, a young couple who'd arrived in September and built a basic cabin with a detached shed 40 feet away. Robert Mitchell had tried to reach his woodpile on the storm's second night when his fire burned too low and his wife started shaking uncontrollably from cold. He'd gotten disoriented in the whiteout, wandered past the shed without seeing it, and collapsed in a drift 60 feet from his own front door. His wife, Anne, had found him by tying a rope around her waist and using their cabin as an anchor point, searching in expanding circles until she literally tripped over his unconscious form. They dragged him inside together, but Robert's feet had frozen solid in his boots. Samuel Whitfield rode for the doctor in Laramie, a 30-mile journey that took him 11 hours through snow that hadn't fully settled. The doctor arrived too late to save 3 of Robert's toes, amputating them on the Mitchell's kitchen table with a bone saw and whiskey for anesthetic. Right now, if you think this kind of practical knowledge matters, if you believe we should preserve how people actually survived before modern conveniences existed, hit that like button. It helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Elizabeth visited the Mitchells the day after the surgery, bringing smoked venison and a basket of dried apples. She sat with Anne, who was still shaking from terror and exhaustion, and didn't say anything about the design of their homestead or their missing woodshed access. She just listened while Anne talked about how scared she'd been, how Robert kept apologizing for being careless, how they were questioning whether they could survive in territory this unforgiving. "You'll survive," Elizabeth said quietly. "You'll learn and adapt and survive. That's what people do out here." Before she left, Elizabeth mentioned that if they needed help rebuilding anything come spring, she and Samuel could spare some time. January brought a different kind of challenge, when temperatures moderated enough to cause intermittent thawing. Conventional woodsheds with standard designs faced a problem. Daytime temperatures would rise above freezing, melting accumulated snow on roof surfaces. That meltwater would drip down onto stacked firewood, soaking the top layers. Then nighttime temperatures would plunge below freezing again, turning the wet wood into ice-covered dead weight that was nearly impossible to split or burn efficiently. Patricia Drummond found herself constantly sorting through her supply, trying to separate wet logs from dry ones, burning through her seasoned stock faster than planned because the wet wood wouldn't ignite properly. Elizabeth's circular design solved this problem through geometry and physics. The shed's roof sloped away from the soddy at a consistent pitch that encouraged water runoff toward the outer edges. But more importantly, the continuous corridor meant that even if snow accumulated on the shed's roof, it never fell directly onto the stacked firewood below. The wood remained protected under the covered space, completely isolated from weather. Additionally, the ambient warmth radiating through the soddy's walls created enough thermal differential to prevent ice buildup on the interior surfaces. While other settlers fought with frozen supplies, Elizabeth's firewood stayed consistently dry and accessible. February proved the system's most subtle advantage: fuel efficiency through optimal seasoning. Wood burns hottest when its moisture content drops below 20%. Freshly cut timber might contain 40 to 60% moisture, requiring months or even years of proper drying before it reaches peak efficiency. Most settlers split their wood in summer, stacked it outdoors to dry through autumn, then moved it to sheds before winter. That worked adequately in moderate climates, but Wyoming's combination of low humidity and temperature extremes created complications. Wood dried outdoors would season well during warm months, but then freeze solid in winter, essentially pausing the drying process and sometimes even reabsorbing atmospheric moisture during thaw cycles. Elizabeth's circular shed maintained consistent conditions year-round. Wood she split in August continued drying through December because the shed's interior never dropped below 10 degrees and the air circulation remained constant. The radiant heat from the soddy's walls actively drew moisture out of the stacked timber, creating a continuous seasoning process that conventional storage couldn't match. By late February, fuel she'd cut in early autumn burned so hot and clean that she could maintain comfortable interior temperatures with roughly 30% less wood than her neighbors required for equivalent warmth. Samuel Whitfield was the first to replicate the design. He'd been planning a conventional shed before helping Elizabeth with her construction, but changed his plans after watching how her system performed through December's blizzard. Samuel modified the design for his specific needs, creating a horseshoe-shaped structure that wrapped 3 sides of his cabin, leaving the south wall open for maximum passive solar heating during short winter days. His version incorporated a small forge in the northwest corner, using the shed's protection to create a year-round workspace for metalworking and tool repair. By March, Samuel's forge had become community infrastructure, with neighbors stopping by to sharpen plows, repair wagon wheels, and fabricate custom hardware. Patricia Drummond sketched plans for a circular shed in her journal that spring, calculating lumber requirements and sketching modifications for her family's larger cabin. Her husband was skeptical about the timber investment until Patricia showed him her fuel consumption records from the previous winter. They'd burned 7.5 cords of wood between November and March, and still suffered through periods of inadequate heating during the worst cold snaps. Patricia estimated that a circular shed could reduce their consumption to perhaps 5 cords while maintaining better temperatures, a savings of 2.5 cords annually. At current timber prices, that would recover the construction cost in 4 winters, maybe 3. The Mitchell family rebuilt completely, moving their cabin location to higher ground and incorporating a 3-sided surrounding shed in the new design. Robert's amputated toes had healed adequately, though he walked with a permanent limp that reminded everyone of December's blizzard. Anne insisted on the shed design despite the extra cost, and Robert didn't argue. "I'm not losing anything else to weather I could have planned around," he said simply, while helping Samuel and Elizabeth frame the structure. By June, the Mitchells had the most protected homestead in the region, with a shed that incorporated lessons from both Elizabeth's design and Samuel's modifications. What spread through the community that spring and summer wasn't just a building technique. It was a fundamental shift in how people thought about frontier construction. The conventional wisdom had always been efficiency through minimalism, Build the smallest, cheapest structures that would meet basic needs, conserve resources for cultivation and livestock. But Elizabeth's circular shed demonstrated that sometimes investing more upfront resources into better infrastructure paid compound returns over time. The extra timber seemed wasteful until you calculated the fuel savings, the eliminated weather exposure, the reduced labor, the increased safety margins during emergencies. By autumn of 1868, 9 homesteads within 15 miles of Elizabeth's claim featured some variation of the surrounding shed design. Each family had adapted the concept to their specific circumstances and needs. The Drummond family's version incorporated a root cellar accessible from inside the shed, creating year-round food storage that stayed between 32 and 45 degrees regardless of external temperatures. Jacob Reeves built a double-walled design that created an insulating air gap between the shed's outer planks and inner structure, further moderating temperature swings. Sarah Chen's husband constructed a partial surrounding shed that focused protection on the prevailing wind directions, saving timber while still capturing most of the design's advantages. The variations proved that Elizabeth's innovation wasn't a rigid blueprint but a flexible principle: integrate fuel storage with living space in ways that create mutually reinforcing benefits. The specifics, full circle versus partial wrap, single wall versus double wall, integrated workshops versus pure storage, could adapt to individual resources, skills, and priorities. What mattered was understanding the underlying physics and logic. Protected fuel stays dry. Accessible fuel requires less dangerous weather exposure. Thermally buffered fuel seasons better and burns more efficiently. A traveling journalist from the Rocky Mountain News visited the region in October 1868, documenting homestead techniques for readers considering Western migration. His article, published in December, described Elizabeth's circular shed as an elegant demonstration of thermodynamic principles applied with frontier practicality, wherein a widow's careful observation transforms conventional lumber into a survival system of remarkable efficiency. The piece included detailed measurements and sketches, noting that while the design required approximately 40% more initial timber than conventional sheds, it reduced fuel consumption by roughly 30% annually while eliminating dangerous weather exposure during supply access. That article circulated through settlements across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana territories, copied and shared among homesteaders always hungry for proven techniques. Elizabeth started receiving letters from people she'd never met, asking technical questions about construction sequences, optimal dimensions, and adaptation strategies for different climates. She answered every letter personally, sharing measurements and explaining the principles in clear language that assumed intelligence but not specialized knowledge. "The design isn't mine," she wrote to a woman in northern Colorado. "I learned it from journal entries about Norwegian families who survived by thinking carefully about winter before it arrived. I'm just passing along what worked." The humility was genuine but incomplete. Elizabeth had done more than copy a technique. She'd understood its underlying logic deeply enough to adapt it confidently to Wyoming's specific conditions. The Norwegian design she'd read about used turf walls and different lumber dimensions. Elizabeth had translated those principles into sod construction with locally available timber, adjusting proportions and details to match available resources and regional weather patterns. That kind of thoughtful adaptation required both intelligence and courage, the willingness to invest significant resources in an unproven concept because the logic seemed sound enough to trust. By 1870, the surrounding shed had become standard practice for new construction in eastern Wyoming territory. When the territorial government commissioned a survey of homestead architecture that year, The report noted that 83% of claims filed after 1868 incorporated integrated fuel storage designs, compared to less than 5% before that date. The shift was attributed primarily to demonstrated performance advantages during severe winter conditions and efficient dissemination of technical information through community networks and published documentation. Elizabeth Thornton lived in her soddy with its circular shed for 18 years, eventually expanding the living space and upgrading to a timber frame house in 1885. But she never dismantled the surrounding shed, just incorporated it into the larger structure's design. By then, she'd become regionally known for agricultural innovations, terraced garden plots that prevented erosion, windbreak tree plantings that moderated temperature extremes, irrigation techniques adapted from methods she'd observed among Chinese railroad workers. The shed was simply her first documented innovation, the one that established her credibility and gave her permission to experiment further. Samuel Whitfield's homestead prospered partly because his forge made him indispensable to the community, and the surrounding shed made the forge practical year-round. He trained 2 apprentices in metalworking, both of whom eventually filed their own claims and built circular sheds before constructing anything else. Patricia Drummond became an informal advisor to new settlers, walking them through construction techniques and helping calculate optimal dimensions for different family sizes. The knowledge spread organically, person to person, demonstration to replication, each success reinforcing the pattern. What's remarkable from our modern perspective is how completely this practical innovation vanished from architectural memory. By 1920, when central heating and coal delivery had reached even remote Wyoming homesteads, the surrounding shed became obsolete almost overnight. Nobody needed integrated firewood storage when furnaces burned coal from a truck delivery or when electric heating made fuel management irrelevant. The technique survived in a few isolated locations, remote line camps, trapping cabins, off-grid homesteads, but disappeared from mainstream building practice within a single generation. If you value preserving knowledge about how people actually survived challenging conditions through thought and planning, rather than just toughness, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting techniques that worked, that kept people alive and comfortable when the stakes were real. This isn't nostalgia, it's a survival manual hidden in history. Elizabeth died in 1909 at age 84, having outlived most of her early critics and many of her supporters. Her obituary in the Laramie newspaper mentioned her contributions to agricultural development and her role in establishing the region's first lending library, but said nothing about the circular shed that had made her locally famous 40 years earlier. By 1909, such structures were common enough to seem unremarkable, just how sensible people built in Wyoming if they had any experience with winter. The homestead itself remained in family hands until 1953, when Elizabeth's grandniece sold it to a ranching operation that demolished the old buildings to make room for modern equipment storage. The circular shed was torn down in a single afternoon, its lumber salvaged for fence repairs and barn modifications. Nobody thought to photograph it, document its dimensions, or preserve any record of its construction. It was just old wood from an obsolete building style, interesting to nobody except the workers who appreciated that the timber was still solid after 85 years of use. Today, if you visit the site where Elizabeth Thornton built her soddy and surrounding shed, you'll find a cell tower and a gravel parking area for ranch vehicles. There's no historical marker, no indication that anything significant happened there. The knowledge that let a widow survive Wyoming winters through intelligent design rather than desperate endurance has evaporated like morning fog, considered irrelevant in an age of thermostats and propane furnaces. But consider what that knowledge represented. The understanding that women could engineer their own survival systems, that careful observation mattered more than physical strength, that investing resources in better infrastructure often paid greater returns than conserving them for immediate consumption. Consider that a widow in 1867, working primarily alone, designed and built a structure that outperformed conventional wisdom so thoroughly that it changed regional building practices within 2 years. Consider that she did this not through dramatic innovation, but through humble attention to what had worked for others in similar circumstances, adapted thoughtfully to her specific situation. The neighbors who laughed at Elizabeth Thornton in September 1867 weren't stupid people. They were experienced frontier survivors applying conventional wisdom that had kept them alive for years. What they missed, what's easy to miss, is that sometimes the strange-looking solution, the one that seems wasteful or overcomplicated, is actually the result of deeper thinking about the actual problem. They saw Elizabeth using too much timber. She saw herself eliminating the risk of freezing to death because she couldn't safely reach her firewood during a blizzard. Both perspectives were factually accurate, but only one accounted for the stakes involved. On the frontier, getting something 90% right could still kill you. The 10% difference between adequate and excellent was often the margin between surviving comfortably and barely enduring, between thriving and suffering, between passing your homestead to your children and dying in a snowdrift 40 feet from your own front door. Elizabeth Thornton understood those stakes viscerally because she'd watched her husband die from complications of exposure he'd suffered trying to reach firewood during a storm. She built her circular shed not to prove anything to her neighbors, but to ensure she would never face that same risk. The fact that her solution proved superior to conventional designs was almost incidental to her primary goal, surviving winter alone without depending on anyone else's help or judgment. That self-reliance wasn't about pride or isolation. It was about clear-eyed recognition of frontier realities. Your neighbors might be generous and helpful, but during a 68-hour blizzard with whiteout conditions and 60-mile-per-hour winds, they might as well be in Philadelphia for all the assistance they can provide. In those moments, you survive based on decisions you made months earlier, infrastructure you built when the weather was calm, systems you designed to function when everything else failed. The circular shed was Elizabeth's insurance against isolation, her hedge against catastrophe, her declaration that she would survive on her own terms through preparation and intelligence rather than luck and endurance. It worked brilliantly, exactly as designed, and the fact that it became community standard within 2 years was simply confirmation that others recognized the logic once they saw it perform under real conditions. So when you see someone doing something that seems strange, that defies community standards or conventional practice, maybe pause before dismissing it. Maybe ask what problem they're solving that you haven't noticed yet. Maybe consider that they've thought longer and harder about their specific circumstances than you have. Maybe recognize that some of the best solutions look foolish right up until they work perfectly, at which point they become obvious to everyone paying attention. That's the real legacy of Elizabeth Thornton's surrounding shed, not the specific construction details, though those were excellent. The legacy is the reminder that thoughtful preparation, executed with skill and informed by careful observation of what's worked before, is what keeps people alive when conditions get hard and help is far away. The frontier is gone. The surrounding sheds are demolished. The people who built them have been dead for a century. But the knowledge they proved, that you can think your way toward survival, that intelligence matters more than strength, that women can engineer solutions as effectively as men when given the chance, that knowledge is permanent if we choose to preserve it. Choose to preserve it. Remember it. Pass it on. Because we never know when we'll need it again, and the cost of forgetting might be higher than we imagine.